Hey, it's your favorite friend Amr from Toronto.
And it is Aaron and Ramadan Kareem to our friends who celebrate. Hi, welcome.
كل عام وانتم بخير. مبارك عليكم الشهر. You're listening to Das Criminal, your favorite podcast with your two favorite co-hosts.
We have a very, very exciting episode for you today.
Oh, yeah, it is a special one. But before we go into that, I do want to give a shout out to Portugal today, celebrating the anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, which overthrew the dictator Salazar in 74, I believe. So solidarity to all our Portuguese listeners out there.
Now, when you say today, do you mean today that we're recording, which is Saturday, or Monday when this comes?
No, yeah, sorry, I should have specified. Yeah, Saturday, April 25th.
We're in the past. Woo!
This is time travel. We're actually talking to you from the past, but live.
We also want to give a special shout out to our friend Fatma, who requested this topic on Patreon.
Yeah, we're doing this for you, our listeners. We are loyal subjects.
If you don't know how Patreon works, basically you pledge a monthly contribution to the podcast and it helps us run things around here. And then we give you bonus content in return. So you get extra full-length episodes, you get chat episodes about politics and stuff like that. And you get more of a say in how we run the podcast, including a direct line to us to suggest episodes like this one.
And this one is going to be really good. So I think without further ado, we can start.
Of course.
So the animosity between the United States and Iran has been described by some political pundits as an intractable conflict, a deep-seated and almost legendary hostility. George W. Bush labeled Iran as one note in his Axis of Evil triad, while the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has called the United States the Great Satan.
But Iran's resentment of the U.S. is not ancient lore, nor is it without merit. In 1953, the CIA overthrew popular Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh and shored up the despotic rule of Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi in order to safeguard British oil interests in Iran. The tale reads like a spy novel. Imperialism, espionage, scheming, bribery, and betrayal are abound.
And today, we're going to bring the story of the brief, wondrous reign of Mohammad Mosaddegh and the clandestine operation to unseat him, an event that changed the course of Iranian history and ultimately has effects that ring around the world today.
So before we jump right into it, we just want to give a quick disclaimer. Iran has a very ancient history, thousands of years of empires rising and falling, and it would be futile to try to summarize all this within a podcast episode. We're doing our best. You could easily create an entire podcast focused on the modern history of Iran, but please do not listen to this and think this is everything there is to say about this coup or that we know everything about it. We've done a lot of research. We want to make these stories accessible to people who listen to them, but we're not trying to say that this is the end-all, be-all story.
Yeah, we're barely scratching the surface here. It's just one episode in the turbulent history of Iran. Well, turbulent in some times, stable in other times, like most empires, really. With stories like this, it's very important to pick a time and place to start. I mean, the place is obvious, it's Iran, but picking the time to start is often very tricky because when you start determines a lot of things and a lot of causalities. So I think it's right to start with Iran at the turn of the 20th century, where it's being ruled by the very widely unpopular Qajar dynasty on the peacock throne of Tehran.
And this is an interesting kind of like mini true crime, unsolved mystery, fun fact. Doing the readings for this episode, I first thought that the term peacock throne just indicated the ostentatiousness of the Persian monarchy, but it actually references a literal chair, like a physical chair. So one of Iran's former Safavid rulers, Nader Shah, briefly reunited the crumbling empire at the beginning of his reign. In 1938, he raided the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, and he took among his plunder the peacock throne. The gold and jeweled throne cost the Mughals twice as much to construct as the entire Taj Mahal. So Nader Shah brought the peacock throne back to Iran, but when he was assassinated in 1747, the throne vanished. Most likely it was taken apart into smaller pieces by military commanders who wanted to take the valuable jewels and probably sell them. But still, the term peacock throne was later adopted in the West as a metonym for the Persian monarchy, and it's still used in text today.
Yeah, I mean, you still hear how the exiled crown prince of Iran, of the Pahlavi dynasty, Mohammad Reza, Reza, sorry, is referred to as the heir to the peacock throne, even though the actual throne has been looted, as you said.
Yeah, I thought it meant peacock as in when someone's peacocking, like showing off. I just thought it was a reference to, like, again, being very ostentatious, but they're talking about a literal chair.
Yeah, a very expensive one by the looks of it. Really blinged out. But the butt that was sitting on that chair in the beginning of the 20th century belonged to the Qajar dynasty, who were pretty much abysmal rulers at this point. They were relying on a lot of loans from Europe and European banks. Iran at the time had a very poor sort of agricultural economy. It was almost semi-feudal, where serfs worked the land, and the land was owned by landlords that taxed the serfs in the produce they harvested. The Qajars, meanwhile, got a lot of loans to live very ostentatious lifestyles, vacationing, drinking, that kind of thing. And they were autocrats. There was no sort of semblance of democracy at the turn of the 20th century.
So under Qajar rule, Iran is weakened in several ways. It lost substantial territory, especially in wars with Imperial Russia. So keep in mind, Russia had not undergone the revolution at this point. It was still being ruled by the czars. The country was unsettled by internal religious movements such as the Babi and Baha'i movements in the mid-19th century. It became increasingly indebted to European bankers and entrepreneurs, as Amr just mentioned. And the Qajars also started to sell off concessions to Britain and Imperial Russia, including the right to print banknotes, run shipping and roads, operate telegraphs, and fish in Iranian waters.
And just to clarify for our listeners, when we say concession, what it basically means is that the government of a country gives foreign entities the rights to do things, whether it's build railroads or harvest resources of some kind, and they usually get some nominal amount of money. But it's usually way undersold, and it's exploitative to the country itself.
Yeah, this is not concessions like snacks at the cinema.
Yeah, it's a lot worse than that. Even though I would argue that concessions in the cinema are also pretty much exploitative, because you're paying like $10 for like a chocolate and a Pepsi.
Yeah, I just like bring a purse and sneak. And also, when you bring your own concessions, at least to the cinemas near me, you can bring alcohol, which they don't normally sell. So.
Oh, our cinemas sell alcohol now. But it's also like a racket. Like you're paying like $15 for like a can of beer.
My friend and I used to go to the cinema in like the shopping center near us. And we would go to this one bar and drink. Then we would get drinks to go and like put them in our coat pockets. And then we would go see the film.
Are you allowed to do drinks to go? I didn't even know that. It's not a thing
This
here.
place, drinks to go were half off. It was cans. Like you buy cans and bottles. It wasn't like a cocktail in a cup.
Huh. Yeah, no, we don't do. I don't think we do that here. I've never seen anyone do drinks to go.
Well, they have them now because of COVID.
It's nice. Yeah, I need to restock my alcohol. But speaking of concessions, I think the biggest concession, the most important for our story at least, happened in 1901 when Muzaffar ad-Din Shah granted a British man by the name of William Darcy a concession for the exclusive privilege to obtain, exploit, develop, render suitable for trade, carry away, and sell natural gas and petroleum for the next 60 years. Darcy then sent people to try and find oil in Iran, but at that time, oil still hasn't been found. So the concession was nominally for the discovery of oil first. It pended the discovery of oil.
It has been found in the sense that in some parts, petroleum has been bubbling out of the ground and people have been using it, but it has never been found in mass and harvested like the Brits did.
Yeah, it wasn't commercially viable. It was more like small amounts. But Darcy was, an entrepreneur, as they call them these days, and sent a bunch of guys to look for oil. But in the meantime, in 1905, a bunch of merchants were arrested in a bazaar in Tehran due to a dispute over sugar prices, and that they were subjected to what was called the bastinado, which is a favorite torture method by the Qajars. They were hung by the wrists while the soles of their feet were beat with rods. Protests erupt across Tehran, and the initial demand was that the governor who issued this punishment be replaced, but the demand soon evolved considerably.
The Iranian people had actually previously protested the Shah's sale of Iranian tobacco rights to Britain in 1891 and 92. And Iranian clergy encouraged boycotts in the bazaars all over the country, so they closed for a general strike. And the boycott forced the Shah to cancel the concession and prove that the monarchy was vulnerable. And this showed the public that they could rally together and force the government to change through street protests and people power.
Yeah, it gave the public a taste of the power of mass mobilization, and it was employed again in 1905 into 1906. And the demands evolved, like I said earlier, and they expanded to demand what they call a representative parliament. So the revolt ended up being called the Constitutional Revolt because it demanded a constitution and a parliament. To which, because of the public pressure, Qajar Emperor Muzaffar ad-Din Shah relents and forms the Majlis in 1906.
The Majlis, or it's sometimes called the National Assembly in English, attempts to institute a series of reforms, including democratizing measures, but it is constantly up against the monarchy, international powers like Britain, and economic recession. And this becomes a pattern of push and pull between the monarchy and the Majlis that leads straight up to the rise of Mosaddegh.
Yeah, it's setting up the stage for a sort of irreconcilable conflict. In 1907, Britain and Russia, and this is still Tsarist Russia, by the way, agreed to a deal to separate Iran into zones of influence. So Russia got the north, the oil-rich south was given to Britain, and there was a neutral middle zone in which Tehran was located that the Qajars could control as long as they didn't piss off either power. Iran was not exactly consulted for this division, more or less just informed that this was going to be done. However, interestingly enough, in 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsars and win power, they renounce all claims to influence in Iran and cancel all of Iran's debt to Tsarist Russia. So go Bolsheviks.
Woo!
Yeah, Lenin was a genius in that, at least, we'll agree. In 1908, oil is discovered in Iran in mass quantities, and commercial viability amounts. The Brits arrange for a company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to absorb William Darcy's concession, and then the British government purchases 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the APOC. It also constructs the world's largest oil refinery at the time on the island of Abadan in the Gulf. It's where the Tigris and Euphrates meets the Gulf in what's known as the Shatt al-Arab Delta. There's an island called Abadan, and they construct a refinery there. And it becomes a sort of colonial outpost, a very classic colonial outpost, where you have the Brits living in these villas with golfing courses and clubs and all that, cafes and bars. And then on the other side of town are these slums for Iranian workers who work in the refinery. There's no running water, there's no electricity, you're living in shacks. It's a decrepit sort of area.
What's interesting, actually, is that later, when the Iranians tried to nationalize oil, as we see, the Brits assumed that the Iranians would be technologically incapable of running the refineries on their own. But that's not true, because they have been doing the work for decades now.
Yeah, like the Brits at that point, besides a few higher up engineers, were basically paper pushers. Most of the labor on the floor was done by Iranians. So the experience was there.
Right.
Yeah, and the concession terms of the oil production was such that the 16% of the profit of the oils was to be given to the Qajar dynasty, while the rest was kept by the company. 16 being 1/6, by the way, not 60, 1/6%. In 1911, the Majlis hires an American banker by the name of Morgan Shuster to reform the tax system, and the Russians and Brits are infuriated because they relied on backroom deals with the Qajars to avoid taxes. The Russians end up sending in troops to shut down the Majlis and kick out the banker, Shuster. This leads to the 1919 Anglo-Iranian Treaty. Britain takes control of Iran's army, treasury, transport, and communications. It's imposed on the feeble Ahmad Shah of the Qajar dynasty, and it's pretty much Britain colonizing Iran in all but name. I want to read a quote here from the Foreign Secretary at the time of Britain, Lord Curzon, from 1919. Quote, If it be asked why we should undertake the task at all, and why Persia should not be left to herself and allowed to rot into picturesque decay, the answer is that her geopolitical position, the magnitude of our interest in the country, and the future safety of our Eastern Empire render it impossible for us now, just as it would have been impossible for us any time during the last 50 years, to disinherit ourselves from what happens in Persia. Moreover, now that we are about to assume the mandate for Mesopotamia, which will make us co-terminus with the western frontiers of Asia, we cannot permit the existence between our frontiers of our Indian Empire and Balochistan and those of our new protectorate, a hotbed of misrule, enemy intrigue, financial chaos, and political disorder. Further, if Persia were to be alone, there is every reason to fear she would be overrun by Bolshevik influence from the north. Lastly, we possess in the southwestern corner of Persia great assets in the shape of oil fields, which are worked for the British Navy and which give us a commanding interest in that part of the world. And to be honest with you, I find that sort of blunt honesty of honest imperialism kind of refreshing. It wasn't coached in any sort of liberal, we're going to civilize the savage language. It was just, it's good for us and we're going to do it.
Yeah, it's almost the century-old version of Donald Trump saying, and we didn't even get the oil. Admitting this is the goal all along. It's oil.
Yeah, pretty much. And honestly, Donald Trump is the heir to this legacy, to Lord Curzon's legacy. We should just get the oil, keep it stable for our pockets, and leave when the oil dries up.
Right, and whatever we have to do to the native population is all in service of that.
Pretty much.
Quite Machiavellian.
And again, very refreshing from the sort of liberal, they don't know how to rule themselves. We should teach them democracy and give them women's rights or whatever.
Right.
And in 1921, communist radicals established an Iranian Socialist Soviet Republic in the north, backed by the USSR.
The Soviets had supported something called the Jungle Movement, which established the Soviet Republic of Gilan on the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, which is the northern part of Iran. So after the 1919 Anglo-Iranian Treaty, Iranian opposition asked the Gilan Republic for help fighting the British Allied forces. But the Gilan Republic was very short-lived as the Soviets withdrew their forces following a treaty with Iran's new leadership.
I think one of the interesting things of the 20th century that I've observed is how poor the Soviets are as an ally. And it's from 1921 here all the way through 1960s and 1970s when the Soviets constantly fail at backing up their proxies, whether it's Egypt in the Suez Wars or Cuba in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just not exactly the kind of ally I would rely on.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So in 1921, Reza Khan takes power. So Reza Khan is a very interesting character. He was born in the Alborz Mountains. He came from a working class family. He was working as a stable boy, became a soldier, and then rose through the ranks very quickly to become a commander of his own unit. In 1921, as commander, he attempts a coup of Ahmad Shah's Qajar dynasty, not entirely overthrowing the Qajars, but sort of moving into town with his troops and forcing Ahmad Shah to install a man by the name of Sayyid Zia as prime minister and to install Reza Khan himself as leader of the elite Cossack brigades in Iran. A few months later, he fires Zia and names himself prime minister, consolidating power. He sort of has a theatrical ascension to power, which I found really amusing. He goes into occultation, basically disappearing into his home village, while secretly arranging for the public to demand for him to return to power. When Ahmad Shah returns and declares an intention to return to Iran, having left Iran, the Majlis immediately calls for Reza to become Shah. And on April 25th, coincidentally the day we're recording, 1926, Reza Khan becomes Shah Reza Pahlavi.
Pahlavi, or sometimes it's pronounced Pahlavi, is actually the name of an ancient language of Iran, and this was a move by Reza Khan to try and link his family to the dynastic history of Iran.
It was a feeble attempt to, gain legitimacy, a sort of veneer of legitimacy.
Yeah, as if people wouldn't remember what happened literally last year.
Pretty much. He's an interesting character, and I want to sort of describe an anecdote from the book we're going to cite as a source, All the Shah's Men, about him. As Shah, he visits a village called Hamdan, where the villagers were starving because the bakers were hoarding grain to increase the price of bread. So Reza orders the first baker he sees to be thrown into his own oven and burnt, and the next day, bread was in every bakery and the prices plummet. He saw himself, I guess, as a modernizer and a man who deeply admired Ataturk.
Isn't that the plot of Hansel and Gretel, where the witch or the old woman tries to get them in the oven, like fatten them up and eat them, but then they lock her in the oven?
Yes, I think. Yeah, do they eat her? Do they end up eating her, or do they sort of just run away?
I do not remember the exact outcome of that story.
That's very dark for a children's story.
Yeah, I think it's a German one.
I can see why the Germans have no sense of humor if you're raised on that kind of story.
Yeah. So during his modernization campaign, Reza Shah abolished political parties, closed presses, outlawed trade unions, built railroads and highways, enlarged the military, and streamlined a centralized bureaucracy. He also believed that Islam held Iran back, and he limited the roles of the mullahs in the public sphere. He abolished Sharia courts, established secular courts based on European legal systems, seized religiously controlled lands, eliminated clerics from government positions, ordered more Western style of dress, and he banned the chador and the hijab for women.
A real woman respecter, that one.
Of
But
course.
also, not his darker side is him being a fascist sympathizer. Really much admired not just Ataturk, but Mussolini and Hitler in Europe. And once quoted in an Iranian newspaper at the time saying, quote, "The cardinal goal of the German nation is to attain its past glories by promoting national pride, creating a hatred of foreigners, and preventing Jews and foreigners from embezzlement and treason. Our goals are certainly the same," end quote.
How subtle.
He certainly comes off with tact here.
Mm.
In 1932, he renegotiates the concession with the Anglo-Persian oil company. The size of the area in which they're allowed to drill is reduced. They guarantee payments of £975,000 annually to the Pahlavi dynasty. And they promise to improve working conditions in Abadan, which has been a sort of stumbling block because it's been dire there. And in return, they extend the period of the concession by an extra 32 years. So it was due to expire in 1961, and they tack on another 32 years to it. And the Shah also didn't like the name Persia for some reason. So he changed the name Persia to Iran, obviously, at that time. And the company name was changed from the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. In World War II, Reza Shah was very much aligned with the Nazis, not outright, but very much sympathized with the Nazis. And the Brits and the Soviets both saw that as a problem, especially with the Soviets needing aid to be shipped through Iran for the most part. So the Soviets and the Brits cooperated and sent troops into Iran in August of 1941, overthrowing the Shah Reza for his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah.
The British fleet at this point was powered in large part by Iranian oil. So with the Brits moving toward Tehran from the south and the Soviets moving in from the north, the Shah was really done for. Reza Shah ended up fleeing to South Africa, which did fight on the side of the Allies, but had a number of Nazi sympathizers within it, and he died there in 1944.
I'm surprised he didn't go to Argentina, but I guess that was too early for fleeing to South America.
Yeah, possibly.
So in this climate, an intrepid hero emerges. His name was Mohammad Mosaddegh, and he was born on May 19th, 1882, to an upper-class family with ties to royalty in the village of Ahmedabad. His uncle was the formidable Prince Farman Farma, who became his political mentor.
This is pretty interesting because unlike Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah, who faked their royal credentials, Mosaddegh actually had royal blood, but he would end up leading the opposition to monarchical totalitarianism.
Yeah, and he was very determined not to in any way, shape, or form exploit his connections. Like he refused positions multiple times because he felt it wasn't right because his uncle was in a position of power, for example. He had a very interesting sort of moral compass. He was very much a man fixated on honor in many ways. And I think it came back to bite him, as we'll see later. He was educated very much so for a man of his class. And the first position of authority he got was at age 16 when he was appointed the chief tax auditor of Khorasan province.
I am 24 years old and I cannot get the IRS to tell me if I am getting a COVID-19 payment or not.
When I was 16, all I was doing was playing video games and sort of ambling through high school. So
yeah.
He was elected to the Majlis in 1906 as a representative from the city of Isfahan, though ironically, he could not yet assume the seat because he was below the legal age of 30. He left to France in 1909 when the Majlis was attacked and returned to Iran for a bit before leaving again for a village in Switzerland. He was the first Iranian to earn a doctorate in law from a European university. In 1917, he received an offer to become deputy finance minister while he was recovering from appendicitis in Baku, and he accepted. However, he became unpopular with the ruling class because he exposed corruption schemes as a deputy finance minister and ended up leaving Iran for Switzerland when the government dismissed him. He returned to Iran in 1919, initially to arrange for suppliers for a shop he was opening up in Switzerland. But as he arrived, he was immediately offered the post of governor of Fars province. Reza Khan, seeing how popular Mohammad Mosaddegh was, tried to use him in 1921, first offering him a post in the finance ministry and then the foreign ministry. However, even though Mosaddegh took those positions, he ended up clashing with the government a lot and with Reza Khan as well, and ended up quitting the government to run for the Majlis as an opposition figure in 1924 and winning. He was seen as a class traitor by the elites for insisting on treating elites equally to the masses, sort of reflecting his moral character. He would refuse to be subsumed into Reza Shah's government despite multiple offers, including the offer of prime ministership. And interestingly, even refused to take the oath of office in the Majlis because it included a vow to respect the Shah's authority, sort of reflecting what we see with Sinn Féin when they win in the occupied north of Ireland and refuse to take office in Parliament in Westminster. Am I right?
Yes.
In 1928, the Shah at the time, Shah Reza, pretty much had enough with this Majlis, so he rigged the elections to have his supporters win. Mosaddegh loses and then is placed on house arrest in Ahmedabad. He remains there, pretty much disappearing from political life for the next several years until 1943. After the Reza Shah has been deposed and replaced with Mohammad Reza, Iran experiences ostensibly free elections for the first time in a long time, and Mosaddegh wins massively. He gets more votes than any other candidate in the Majlis.
This is the time when the Majlis again begins to reassert itself and demand some actual political power instead of just rubber stamping whatever the Shah and his British benefactors wanted.
And yeah, it's at this time that we see the Majlis pretty much the unstoppable force meets the immovable object between the Majlis on one hand and the British and Shah on the other. As we enter post-war Iran, the north is occupied by the Soviets, the south is occupied by the British, and there's a neutral zone, very much mimicking the turn of the 20th century. At this time, Prime Minister Mohammad Farouqi is a British puppet, and you end up with a rotating door of prime ministers. They change like every few months, but they're all pretty much British puppets. And at this time, you see the rise in a party called Today, which initially was a loose coalition of liberals, reformers, and social activists, and the name Today is Farsi for the masses. However, in 1944, the pro-Soviet Marxist-Leninist faction in Today seizes the party and turns it into a sort of very much hard-left Marxist-Leninist party, winning seats in the Majlis and using their influence in the parliament to push legislation eliminating child labor, guaranteeing maternity leave and minimum wages, and reducing the work week to 48 hours. In 1946, Today declare a People's Republic of Azerbaijan in northern Iran, where there's a large and sizable Azeri minority. Stalin initially sends up troops to back them up, but the Prime Minister Ahmed Qavam flies to Moscow and convinces Stalin to back down.
Qavam was able to do this in part by promising the Soviets oil concessions in northwest Iran. The problem, as the Soviets would find out, is that the concessions were worthless because there is no oil in northwest Iran. It's pretty much all in the southern Gulf region.
I just had a very grim image of Prime Minister Qavam on the phone with Stalin being like, bro, it's just a prank. Bro, it's just a prank, I swear to God.
It worked, though.
It did. The Soviets end up backing down and retreating, which allows the Iranian troops to enter Azerbaijan and crush the rebellion. And the local Azeris execute the Tudeh leaders, reflecting that the Tudeh were not very much widely supported by the locals in that area. In 1949, there was a failed assassination attempt by a religious fanatic on Muhammad Reza Shah. The Shah uses this as an excuse to arrest Tudeh members, even though the assassin was not a member of Tudeh. He was very much a right-wing religious fanatic. The Shah also passes a law changing parliament. So instead of the Majlis nominating a prime minister and the Shah approving, he reversed the process where he nominates a prime minister and the Majlis has to approve or deny that. He also establishes a Senate with the Shah appointing half its members, acting as a sort of oversight of the Majlis. There's also another law he passes, whether he can dissolve both houses of parliament and call elections as he pleases. He pretty much uses the assassination to consolidate power in a very sort of politically savvy way, I have to say. In the same year, there were multiple strikes in Abadan due to the deplorable conditions of the workers there. Sir William Fraser of the AIOC ends up offering a supplemental agreement to the Shah to amend the current agreement between the AIOC and the Iranian government. The Shah obviously approves because, you don't want to piss off the British if you're a monarch, but the Majlis is in opposition. So the Shah rigs elections in 1949 to try and get his supporters in the Majlis so he can get the supplemental agreement through the Majlis. There are huge protests led by Mosaddegh for this rigging, which leads to a sit-in in front of the Shah's palace by Mosaddegh and others that embarrasses the Shah so much that he ends up calling a new election. The Shah calls a new election and Mosaddegh wins. The Shah also visits the US and asks for weapons, while President Truman at the time insists on the Shah to reform his country. And this is quite interesting because at the time the US's foreign policy during the sort of beginning of the Cold War was the Marshall Plan, where they basically threw money at a bunch of countries to establish what could be called social democracies, I guess, to stem the tide of Bolshevik radicalism and communist radicalism. And Truman, I guess, wanted to apply the same tactic to Iran to avoid the threat of the communists taking over. However, the Shah was only interested in weapons and, might is right attitude. In 1950, Mosaddegh formed the National Front, which is a coalition of like-minded individuals, not necessarily a political party. It's pretty much a nationalist, post-colonial, third worldist coalition. They end up winning seats in the Majlis. Mosaddegh himself was a seat as well. The Brits at this time send a new ambassador to Iran, and this is a very important man, Sir Francis Shepherd. He's a very old-school colonial, the kind of condescending, patronizing, Rudyard Kipling type, Cecil Rhodes type, who thinks that the world belongs to Britain because, Britain ruled the sea and all that stuff. The Majlis at this time creates an 18-member committee to investigate the supplemental agreement that the Shah is trying to push through. And the committee is chaired by none other than Mosaddegh. Meanwhile, the Shah appoints one of his lackeys, General Razmara, as prime minister to try and get the supplemental agreement pushed through. However, there's popular anger at the supplemental agreement from the masses all the way through the Majlis. Even bringing into a coalition the National Front on Mosaddegh on one hand and the religious establishment on the other, led by Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, another very important figure. Interestingly, at this time, a young man by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini refuses to join the National Front because he believes Mohammad Mosaddegh had forsaken the path of Islam and embraced secularism, to which Khomeini thought Iran is incompatible with. Also in 1950, across the border from Iran, the Arabian American oil company, Aramco, had renegotiated a deal with the Sauds to split the profits of the oil 50-50 between the Saudi government and the company. And Ambassador Shepard asks Britain to do the same, but is denied. At this time, Britain is still approaching itself as a sort of old school imperial power and thinks it can just bully everyone around.
The oppositionists in Iran at this point claimed that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was a state within a state and didn't pay enough taxes. There was talk of nationalization, and the idea was becoming increasingly popular among the Iranian populace. But crucially, the Majlis did first try to negotiate a better deal with Britain and was just met with pig-headedness.
Yeah, at the time, the British media made it look like Iran was the one that was being unreasonable. But initially, the Majlis was very much open to negotiation and compromise. But the British, much as they always have been throughout history, were stubborn, unreasonable, and uncompromising, and thought they could just bully their way into control, oblivious to how the world has changed in the post-war era. Ambassador Shepard tells Prime Minister Razmara to take a strong line against those ingrates who did not appreciate, quote, the immense service to mankind of the British people in recent times, end quote. In 1951, Razmara is assassinated by a man who was inspired by the fatwas the religious authorities have been issuing, denouncing Razmara and the government for cooperating with the Brits. In March 15th, 1951, the Majlis, at this point having completely given up on negotiating with the British, vote to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This is a big, big deal. The British did not see this coming. And on April 28th, 1951, the Shah had arranged the Majlis session, called the Majlis into session to confirm the British sympathizer Syed Zia as Prime Minister. The first speaker to rise and speak is a right-winger by the name of Jamal Imami, a British stooge through and through. And he launches into a tirade criticizing Mosaddegh, praising Syed Zia and the Shah, and sort of concludes by sarcastically intoning that if Mosaddegh had such problems with the previous prime ministers, which he was always criticizing, why doesn't he try being a prime minister? Mosaddegh calmly stands up, looks at him, and accepts the nomination, which is, in my opinion, like a mic drop moment. Like, this is the moment where Mosaddegh basically drops the mic.
Yeah, it's a very badass thing to do.
Yeah, he basically maneuvered to make those Shah-sympathizing right-wingers offer him the prime ministership out of spite, and then take it to sort of throw it in their face.
Mm-hmm.
So Mosaddegh accepts the prime ministership, and shock turns into pandemonium in the Majlis. They end up accepting his nomination by a margin of 79 votes pro, 12 against, naming Mosaddegh prime minister and nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Ha ha.
Owned. At this point, the Brits are furious. This is a climate, by the way, the post-war climate in the US. You had President Harry Truman, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and Assistant Secretary George McGee. Their approach at the time was to be heavily sympathetic to third world nationalism as a counterweight to the Soviets. Basically, America was very new to the sort of global domination game, and they saw themselves under the Truman and Acheson sort of administration. They saw themselves as counterweight to the Soviets, the beginning of the Cold War, obviously, but they also tried to position themselves as liberators of the colonized world in sort of a progressive force that can protect the third world while making sure that communists don't take power.
Yeah, as we said at the beginning of the episode, the conflict between the United States and Iran is not ancient. I don't know how it could be, considering that the US is only a couple hundred years old, whereas Iran is actually like an ancient society. But at one point, these countries were maybe friends, maybe frenemies, depending on how you want to look at it, but they certainly weren't nemesis.
Yeah, there wasn't the hatred you see today. It certainly was very different in that time. The Truman administration was very much sympathetic to the demands of Iran and other third world countries in their effort to decolonize. So they tried to position themselves as friends to nationalists everywhere to counter the Soviet communist-backed nationalists. The Brits, on the other hand, still saw the world through the sort of pre-war prism of British imperialism and were urging America to interfere after they saw Iran nationalize their company. Ambassador Shepard blamed America because America at the time had made a deal with the Sauds to split Aramco 50-50, and he blamed them for giving ideas to Iran, which is very much a British thing to do. Truman's government was urging compromise, but behind closed doors, the Americans were very much frustrated with British stubbornness and pig-headedness. On May 1st, 1951, the Shah, under pressure from the Majlis, signs into law changing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which, by the way, today is known as British Petroleum. They didn't go away. They're still there, just a different name, to what should be called the National Iranian Oil Company. In response, the Brits end up sabotaging the refinery in Abadan, basically destroying a bunch of machines, emptying all the ships in harbor of their oil, and sending in frigates to blockade the Gulf.
Yeah, they throw a giant temper tantrum, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of like the equivalent of, I don't know if any one of our listeners has been there, but if you're playing football in the park with your friends and the one kid who owns the ball gets really pissed off and takes the ball and goes home, it's pretty much that.
Everyone hates that kid.
It's the most insufferable kid. And he's British in this analogy as well. The US at this point tries to play shuttle diplomacy, going between Britain and Iran, trying to find a deal. But at this point, neither side is willing to compromise. The Majlis, which initially was trying to find a deal for a 50-50 split, at this point, it sees the nationalization as a fait accompli. And for the Brits, they were not willing to concede control of oil in Iran no matter what. And the US really very much saw the Brits as a bigger problem than Iran.
There's also the threat here that other countries would follow suit and nationalize their own oil industries. And this actually did end up happening in some cases in Venezuela and in Libya, for instance. It's not that those fears were unfounded, but that the world is moving forward and this is the future.
Yeah, I mean, can you blame them? Like, the oil is in your sovereign country, being dug up by your workers, refined by your workers, and shipped by your workers, and the only foreign influence is shareholders and high-level administrators. It's quite humiliating.
Exactly.
So at this point, Britain, by the way, is at this point under a Labour government. So the notion that the Labour Party in Britain was always anti-imperialist or a sort of internationalist party is a joke at best, a bad joke.
I mean, Exhibit A, Tony Blair.
Yeah. And who was the successor? Gordon Brown? Yeah, Gordon Brown, that's the one. At this point, it was Clement Attlee, who is glorified in Britain for developing the National Health Service, but he was also the Prime Minister during this time. And him and Foreign Secretary Morrison end up sending Secret Intelligence Service agents, SIS agents, to Iran, beginning to plot for a coup to overthrow Mosaddegh.
SIS is like MI6. Like, this is some real James Bond shit.
Yeah, they're not pleasant people. And just to reiterate, this is in 1951. They weren't willing to compromise. At no point were they willing to negotiate. They immediately went for the manual, the British imperialism manual, flipped through the pages to overthrow and coup. And that's the only page in the manual, obviously, and went for it. The Brits began undermining Iran to pressure them to concede. They started blockading oil shipments coming out of Abadan, causing huge economic pressure. Where have we heard that before? And conflict in the Majlis between the National Front and members of parliament that were sympathetic but saw the Majlis as being too intransigent to compromise with the Brits. Divide and conquer, basically, the old tried and tested British strategy. At this point, America replaces its ambassador in Iran, the initial ambassador Grady, who was very much sympathetic to Iranian nationalism, with Loy Henderson, a classic Cold Warrior who saw the world in strict East-West terms, and you're either with America or with the Bolsheviks, with the Soviet Union. And this was pretty much the writing on the wall, like the winds were changing at this point. On October 8th of 1951, Mosaddegh, as Prime Minister of Iran, flies to New York City to address the United Nations over the nationalization of the oil company. In the meantime, the UK is facing internal elections between the incumbent Attlee and the sort of decrepit corpse of Winston Churchill, barely shuffling about, who, as belligerent and racist as ever, was insisting that military force should be used to assert control of the oil company. Churchill ends up winning in 1951, partly on that discourse, on that rhetoric. In the UN, Mohammad Mosaddegh's argument was that the UN had no jurisdiction over this conflict because it wasn't a conflict between two countries, but a conflict between a country, Iran, and a private company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. His speech was so well received, and the Iranian politics were so savvy that the UN ends up voting to postpone discussion on this matter to an unspecified date, which was indecisive but was a humiliating defeat for America and Britain, who expected a lot more denunciation of Iran from the UN. One of the interesting things at this time is the Rosemary incident in 1952, where the Rosemary ship, which was chartered by Italy to go up the Gulf to buy Iranian oil from Abadan, it goes up, gets the oil, and it was surrounded by British frigates, and they forced it to port in the British protectorate at the time of Aden in modern-day Yemen. And after that, basically every country sort of looks the other way and tries to ignore Iran. They think that buying Iranian oil, no matter how cheap, is not worth the struggle with the British Navy. In 1952 also, Mosaddegh resigned as prime minister after getting into a tussle with the Shah. At this point, it's important to note that the prime minister runs all the cabinet except the war ministry, which is under control by the Shah. Mosaddegh demands control of the war ministry. The Shah refuses, so Mosaddegh tenders his resignation. The pro-British Ahmed Kavam is reinstated, and protests erupt demanding that Mosaddegh return. Kavam deploys the military to fire on the protesters, but large swathes, I don't know how you pronounce that word, swathes?
I think either is okay.
English is a second language, folks. Swathes of the Iranian military defect, and even the police join the protesters. The Shah sees the writing on the wall and asks for Kavam's resignation and reinstates Mosaddegh, conceding to him the war ministry.
Mosaddegh now has a new kind of legitimacy, and he consolidated power outside the monarchy. He established himself as the head of the military rather than the Shah. He disbanded the assembly's upper house and forced the lower house to resign. He seized royal lands, confiscated royal charities, and reduced the palace's budget, effectively isolating the Shah in his palace.
It was a master move. It was very much a gamble, but a master move. At this point, the Brits have had enough tit for tat, and they decide to focus on the plan to overthrow Mosaddegh. For this, they pick a person to replace him, a man by the name of General Fazlollah Zahedi, who was sort of a royalist military commander. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister again, tries to convince Harry Truman to back the coup, but Truman will not have any of it. At this point, Sir Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary under Churchill, says a quote, "They were rug dealers, and that's all they were. You should never give in, and they would always come around and make a deal if you stayed firm." End quote.
Wow, that's so not racist at all.
Yeah, these people are fucking freaks, man. Like this is he's saying this in 1951. Like, it's not, like, Jesus Christ. In the meantime, Ayatollah Kashani, who we mentioned earlier, was elected as Speaker of the Majlis. However, his position as Speaker ends up creating a schism and a rivalry between him and Mosaddegh, as they both become political rivals. In 1952, the US has elections. Truman decides not to run again, and Dwight Eisenhower wins the Republican ticket on a strong anti-communist platform and ends up winning the presidency. And Eisenhower is very much different from Truman in that he is very anti-communist and very much sympathetic to British desires for coups.
Yeah, we should probably also mention here that Mosaddegh is a supporter of liberal democracy. There is no good evidence that he really espouses communist ideology, aside from the oil nationalization, but that was popular beyond the Tudeh party, beyond the Communist Party. You see this again with Patrice Lumumba in the DRC, in Zaire, where they depose him saying that he's a communist, but that's just not really the truth. He's a little bit to the left of where they want him to be, and that's really it.
Yeah, no, perfect example with Lumumba. It's the same thing where you have this sort of post-colonial nationalist leader that wants to nationalize some resources to run the country, and he gets accused of being communist and overthrown, even though they're really not communist at all.
Yeah, it's just something to throw at them to legitimize this coup.
Yeah, now the coup is well underway. It's called Operation Ajax in the US and Operation Boot in the UK. It is masterminded by a very interesting individual by the name of Kermit, which is the second worst Kermit I've ever heard of after the Sesame. Was Kermit from Sesame Street or the
No,
frog?
he's from Muppets, and also, how dare you say that?
I'm not a big fan of that frog. I don't know why. His name was Kermit Roosevelt, and he was the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. And he was the CIA head of the Middle East. In 1952, Mossadegh had had enough of the Brits and he kicked them all out. So Roosevelt had flown into Tehran to pretty much mop up all British assets. Chief among those are the three Rashidyan brothers, who were three Iranian brothers that were very valuable to the Brits and then would become very valuable to the Americans. Saifullah, Asadullah, and Qudratullah. And they were very much voluntary, like allies of the Brits and the Americans. They weren't coerced in any way, shape, or form. There was communication between Roosevelt and the SIS, the British Intelligence Service, in 1952 that showed that Churchill was very insistent on a coup. And the stage at this point was set. All they needed to do was convince the Americans. The Brits end up sending agents to Washington to propose the coup to the Eisenhower administration. But instead of the sort of talking about oil and money, they sort of couch the language in the rhetoric of anti-communism. And like you said earlier with Lumumba, Mosaddegh is a communist, he's friends with Today, he's going to have the Bolsheviks take over, it's going to be a satellite state for the Soviets, all that, Red Scare stuff. At this point, the Eisenhower administration had the Dulles brothers running the foreign show. You had the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the CIA Director, Allen Dulles. They were both very much gung-ho about coups and overthrows. They pressured Eisenhower, and they basically had him come around to the idea of a coup. So the coup was a go. The US tapped up General Zahedi, which the British had earmarked as a replacement for Mossadegh, and pick him as the new prime minister once everything gets underway. In the meantime, tribal leaders in the south of Iran were bribed to revolt. They were crushed by the Iranian military, but the seeds were sown for Mossadegh to be portrayed as a power-hungry dictator. In the meantime, mobs who were upset at the crushing of the revolt descend on Mossadegh's house and end up forcing him to flee through a back garden. And it was suspected that this mob was instigated by Ayatollah Kashani. Meanwhile, the Rashidyan brothers end up managing to peel Kashani completely away from Mossadegh, along with other Majlis members that were previously sympathetic to Mossadegh, but through bribery, coercion, promises of promotion, they end up getting peeled away from Mossadegh's faction and become vociferous opposition to him. Kashani, especially having the legitimacy of being an Ayatollah and therefore a religious figure, denounced Mossadegh over and over in speeches with special vehemence. To a population like Iran at the time, when an Ayatollah goes against you, that's not that great. It's quite bad. In April of 1953, the Rashidyans organize a bunch of thugs to kidnap and kill the Tehran chief of police, General Mahmoud Ashfartas, who was a big Mossadegh loyalist and a man who could have stopped the coup. He would have been a major obstacle, at least. So they kidnap and kill him. Now the stage is set. In August 15th of 1953, Roosevelt initiates the coup by sending coup-friendly Colonel Nasiri to arrest both Mohammad Mosaddegh and Chief of Staff General Riahi. The coup fails spectacularly. They've had word about the coup. General Riahi ends up arresting Nasiri as well as other co-conspirators, and the police are deployed on the street.
What's interesting is that they show up to Mossadegh's house to arrest him, and he's not there. Like, they ring the doorbell, and nobody comes to the door. And then later Mossadegh is like, I'm going to arrest you.
Yeah. And they show up at his house at like 11 p.m. So he should, by all accounts, he should be there. So
yeah, they think they'll catch him in the bathtub. He'll be easy to grab.
Yeah. So it was very much, it's one of those things that's like, it's a what if scenario. What if Mossadegh was alert and really crushed the coup? But, c'est la vie. Roosevelt, being the gung-ho CIA agent that he was, didn't give up. He immediately drives to where General Zahedi has been stowed away in preparation for the coup on the next day and offers to redo the coup and succeed this time. And one of the most important things at this time is that the Shah, Muhammad Reza Shah, had flown out of Iran in anticipation of the coup via Iraq to Rome. But before leaving, he had given Roosevelt two firmans, which are decrees, Shah decrees, the first firing Mossadegh and the second appointing General Zahedi as prime minister. So the firmans were there to give an air of legitimacy to the coup. Roosevelt's first move was to have the firmans copied en masse with one of the first photocopying machines of the era and distributed across Tehran, forming mobs that wanted to support the coup. Mossadegh's government assumed at this point that the Shah was behind the coup and the Shah alone. However, they were unfortunately very wrong on that. They didn't at all assume foreign interference. Roosevelt had corrupt newspapers printing out lies that Mossadegh was the one actually behind the coup and he was the one trying to overthrow the Shah instead of the other way around. Which is, by the way, it sort of shows you not to trust the mainstream media, especially when they talk about governments that are unfriendly to the US.
Yeah, you don't have to be totally cynical, but be skeptical.
Yeah, a healthy dose of skepticism. Roosevelt also sent an American general around Tehran basically offering bribes and promises of promotion to various military officers and outposts in Tehran, and gained some success. He gained a bunch of officers to his side. He then organizes a false flag mob on August 17th, the Monday, that would run around shouting slogans supporting Mossadegh and communism while destroying property and causing violence.
Yeah, there are really long-term effects of this, especially in the Middle East, because now grassroots protests are labeled by their opponents as CIA-sponsored psyops, and it's happened before in Iran, so it's not ridiculous to assume that it would happen again. It's not as though you can say this is something that never happens, but the agency of legitimate protesters and their grievances is undermined, and a person who decides to protest the government in Iran, for instance, is always going to be up against accusations that they've been put up to it by the CIA. And you can even see effects of this in the United States today regarding Russiagate, because if we would do this to other people, why wouldn't they do it to us? So congrats to Eisenhower and Kermit Roosevelt for planting those seeds.
It's very depressing because, for instance, in this protest, even though Roosevelt had bribed, like through the Rashidyan brothers, had bribed the people to form this false flag mob, the mob grew in size to the point where actual Mossadegh supporters and actual communists joined the mob because they're like, yeah, these people are communists, they're yelling communist slogans. And actual communists joined the mob because they had legitimate grievances with the Shah and wanted to show support for Mossadegh. Just because a protest is initially CIA planted, it doesn't mean it doesn't have protesters who are legitimate or have agency.
Yeah, it's just an old school form of astroturfing.
Yeah, and like the flip side of that is a lot of regimes in the Middle East and elsewhere, a lot of entrenched regimes will always accuse the protests of being like foreign, like, Israeli or American backed, just to discredit them, whether they're legitimate or not. At this point, Ambassador Loy Henderson was sent by Roosevelt to meet Mossadegh and spread false stories of Americans being harassed on the phone and in person by anti-American Iranians, and that basically tugging at Mossadegh's heartstrings. That's one of the things Mossadegh is vulnerable to, is sort of sympathy, and because, he's a human, not a reptile, friend of Jeffrey Epstein.
What does that mean, though? Like, Iranians on the phone harassing Americans? Do they just, dial American phone numbers and it's like, oh no, honey, the Iranians are on the phone again, calling me a dingbat?
Yeah, literally, that's what Henderson told Mossadegh, that Iranians would call American households and swear at them, even though the kids picked up and the kids listened to all this dirty language. I swear to God.
Okay, so there's this fake Iranian campaign of telephone harassment.
But it worked. It worked because Mossadegh, again, he's a very sympathetic person, and he was shaken by this and ends up ordering the police to suppress the pro-Mossadegh mob that has formed. And he unleashes the police chief, General Mohammad Daftari, who is very much a royalist, very much a Shah supporter, and very much in on the conspiracy. And Daftari goes hog wild, beating up protesters left, right, and center, tear gas, batons, the whole nine yards, on protesters while they were astroturfed initially, in large part contained Mossadegh's most loyal and fervent supporters.
Right. And also, that sort of thing just really can cause chaos in a country.
Yeah, it pretty much like anarchy, pandemonium. At this point, Roosevelt moves on to the next stage of his master plan, organizing pro-Shah demonstrations for Wednesday, August 19th. And he ends up bribing Ayatollah Kashani, who was one of Mossadegh's most fervent supporters, and ends up turning against him to incite his supporters to join the pro-Shah rally. And, Kashani uses the same rhetoric Khomeini used, that, Mossadegh was un-Islamic, liberal, secular, went against all that Islam stands for, this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, you had the Rashidian brothers, their agents, pretty much walking the streets, handing out wads of cash to people to join this mob. This mob becomes unstoppable. It basically swells. Usually, you'd have counter-protesters, people on the other side showing their where their allegiances lie. But at this point, Mohammad Mossadegh's supporters, having heard Mossadegh, who had issued a speech and an order to stay home, they respected his wishes because, they support him. So they stayed home. And then you also had Today, which were the Communist Party, and Today could have stopped this because Today had a very much sizable representation among the working class, especially in Tehran. Earlier, Today had asked Mossadegh to arm their cadres, so to form armed cadres to defend the government as shock troops, but Mossadegh refused. Quote, "If I agree to arm a political party, may God sever my right arm." I find this very interesting because what you separates people like Castro, who succeeded at staying in power, from people like Mossadegh, I guess, is the ability to be pragmatic when needed and to get really dirty to try and fight imperialism. And I think Mossadegh is in many ways an idealist and a person who was honorable to a fault.
Yeah. Well, so was Lumumba, too.
Yeah, and look what happened to them.
So, what is the trick?
Arm your supporters.
Get down and dirty, or get nukes.
Yes, yeah, the North Korea approach. And if you already have them, don't give them up. Gaddafi gave them up, and look what happened to him.
Saddam, too.
Yeah. At this point, police officers in the streets end up leading those anti-Mossadegh mobs. And you end up hearing chants, which should be very familiar to us today, of Marg Bar Mossadegh, meaning death to Mossadegh, and long live the Shah. Eventually, gunfights erupt in several areas between pro-Shah police and pro-Mossadegh police and military. The mobs free arrested conspirators from the earlier failed coup, including Colonel Nasri, who immediately mobilizes the Imperial Guard. A garrison commander at Kermanshah, to the west of Tehran, ends up being mobilized to support the coup and moves his army to Tehran, marched on Tehran. Meanwhile, you have tribes from the south that had earlier been crushed, but are being bribed with American money, march up to Tehran as well to support the coup. On the mob and the tribes and so on, I just want to quote here from Richard Cottam, who was in on Operation Ajax among the staff in Washington, D.C. Quote, "The mob that came into North Tehran was decisive in the overthrow, and it was a mercenary mob. It had no ideology, and that mob was paid with American dollars." This is all in the Stephen Kinzer book, by the way, All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle Eastern Terror.
There's also a documentary called American Coup, which features Stephen Kinzer, that talks about this, which is what I watched.
Yeah, he's really good when it comes to covering this. Meanwhile, you had pockets of resistance to this coup, including in Mossadegh's house, where loyal soldiers were building fortifications to mount a defense and were resisting wave after wave of military assault. Kermit Roosevelt, at this point, ends up driving to General Zahedi's hideout, and ironically, the latter at this point was hiding in his underwear, which shows you how undignified and fucking sleazy he is. And basically, Roosevelt orders him to put on his uniform, just as royalist tanks arrive to carry the new Prime Minister Zahedi through the streets. In Rome, the Shah was dining with his wife when a bunch of reporters storm into the restaurant to inform him of developments in Tehran. He jumps to his feet and shouts, I knew it, they love me." What a fucking idiot.
What a cocky little prick.
What a tool, man. What a fucking tool. At this point, Mohammad Mossadegh's chief of staff, General Riyahi, was already arrested. So the military, or at least the military loyal to Mossadegh, was in disarray. There was no cohesion to mount a resistance. Mossadegh flees his house from a back alley with a bunch of aides, just as the military storm in, the Shah's military, and the house is looted. There were several dead assailants around his house, all found with 500 riyal notes in their pockets, which tells you all you need to know. Meanwhile, Zahedi drives to the radio station and announces via radio that Mohammad Mosaddegh has 24 hours to turn himself in. At 6 p.m. on Thursday, Mohammad Mosaddegh called Zahedi to turn himself in. He's moved to a military prison, indicted by a military tribunal for treason, and sentenced to 3 years of prison, which he serves fully, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life in the village of Ahmedabad, where he has very few visitors, bar his family, and where he died.
The military tribunal is a total kangaroo court. Mosaddegh actually put up a really good defense, but it doesn't end up mattering whatsoever.
Yeah, the sentence was already made up before.
He was an incredible orator and legally educated scholar as well, but it just he was guilty from the moment he surrendered.
Yeah.
So what are the political effects of this coup, other than sowing a lot of discontent in Iran toward the United States, of course? Muhammad Reza Pahlavi returns as Shah, and he uses the military to crush his political foes. He rules without any significant political opposition, and one way he does this is by dividing the parliament into two parties, both of which are loyal to him. So he turns the democracy into a total farce, basically. He also creates something called SAVAK, which is an intelligence security service, and they are notorious for rounding up and torturing dissidents. He cancels the oil nationalization and negotiates a new deal that split the oil revenue 50-50 between the government and the oil companies. And if you remember, this had been Mossadegh's first offer to the British, and they rejected it. The Shah was now loyal to the Americans for helping him return to the throne, and the oil concessions now went to Americans as well as British companies. And again, the Iranian people did not forget about what the Americans had done by ousting Mossadegh. And in our next episode, we will discuss the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. So stay tuned for a part 2 to this episode.
Yeah, what's interesting in the 1979 revolution is that the first president of the post-Shah era was a man by the name of Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, and he was very much an admirer of Mossadegh. One of the other interesting things regarding the political impact of this coup, this was the first of many coups the US will go on to organize around the world to overthrow unfriendly governments, unfriendly in the case of being friendly to the US company and oil interests and so on, economic interests, sorry. In Kinzer's book, there's an interesting sort of conclusive scene where Kermit Roosevelt goes back to Washington to debrief with the Dulles brothers. And he mentions that this shouldn't be a tactic to be used often. It was successful in Iran, but you never know what could happen in the future, the ramifications of it, which is very sort of insightful for someone like Kermit Roosevelt to sort of point out. But at this point, the Dulles brothers had no need of him, and they were already looking forward to it. Like, Iranian coup in 1953 was the first of these kind of coups, and the Dulles brothers were already looking to their next coup, which was going to happen in Guatemala.
Yeah.
So it set the stage for American interference in other countries.
And even if the United States doesn't do a coup, there's always now the fear that they might do a coup if you don't behave the way that they want you to.
Yeah. I mean, you see it with Iran now, and we'll go into detail in the next episode, but you see it now with the US backing cults like the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, using them as a sort of government in waiting should the Iranian government fall.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode on Iran. Again, we'll be back next week, Monday, with part 2, so stay tuned for that. If you like the podcast, please take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, because it really helps other people to find our show. when they search for topics that we've covered because it pushes us up in the rankings. So if people search for Mosaddegh, we want our podcast to be one of the first ones that pops up.
Yeah, we want to be popular. We demand validation from strangers.
If you want to support us even more, you can contribute to our Patreon. Again, we give you full-length episodes the first Wednesday of every month, plus some casual episodes where we talk about news and politics and the books that we're reading, things like that. So we also give you a shout out on the show when you first sign up, and you can have a more direct say in how we run the podcast. We always put the link for that in the description.
Yeah, this episode was requested by our Patreon subscriber Fatima. So you could get your own episodes as well.
Yeah, so thank you guys for tuning in. We hope that you're all staying safe.
Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful week ahead, and we'll see you next time.
Bye guys.
Bye.